Hi, my name is Maren Ellis, and I'm from Kansas State University. And today I'm going to be talking about my summer research, which is the additive manufacturing of polymer-derived ceramic fiber reinforced polymer matrix composites. So to go over a brief overview what this presentation will look like, I'll go into a brief background of stereolithography. This is the technique that I used to create my samples this summer and to fabricate those. And I learned a lot about this summer, so going briefly into that. And then we'll be looking at the motivation for my research, and then my research itself, the process that I did, and then the results that came from that. So first of all, stereolithography, or SLA, is the process of using a UV light to solidify a liquid photocurable resin in a layer-by-layer process. The stereolithography machine in our lab used the bottom-up approach, which basically describes where the laser source is coming from, which means it's coming from the bottom. And this means that there's a transparent bottom, and that the build platform starts pressed against that bottom, and then it raises up one layer thickness and allows for that resin to be exposed to the laser. The laser scans across that, solidifying that layer, and then the build platform raises up another layer, allowing for fresh resin to flow in, and that process to continue, so on and so forth, until we finally have the final 3D printed structure. So how this solidification process actually happens is through photopolymerization. And here's this graphic to briefly describe this. So this is our liquid resin per se, and in it we have small molecules, which are oligomers and monomers, and then we also have our photoinitiators. And so when the laser scans over this liquid resin, those photoinitiators become reactive, and they start to break the bonds in the small molecules. Those small molecules then, to seek stability, start to form covalent bonds with each other, and they start to form chains and to polymerize, which then this continues until we are left with a chain, a cross-linked structure, and our cured resin. And in this process, our photoinitiators are consumed, and so they are no longer a part of that final cross-linked polymer structure. And so how we can use stereolithography to fabricate our polymer-derived ceramics, in theory, we should be able to do this because with polymer-derived ceramics start out as a pre-ceramic polymer. And so they would need to be made photoreactive, and then they can be used in this process as well to create those complex geometries. Which brings us to the motivation for using our polymer-derived ceramic fiber reinforced composites. So on the left, we had intended to use that pre-ceramic polymer photocurable resin, and we would have obtained that from France and had that sent over. However, it was unavailable in the quantity that we needed for our commercial SLA machine. That machine requires a minimum of 100 milliliters of our resin, and that was unattainable, and it was especially unattainable in the short amount of time that we had this summer. And so what we had intended to do was to have that photocurable pre-ceramic polymer resin and to reinforce that with fibers and see how the toughness increased due to that. However, we were unable to do that. So instead, we opted for using a commercial clear resin that was already photocurable and reinforcing that with polymer-derived ceramic fibers to reinforce that. And we can see that demonstrated here, how reinforcing it with those ceramic fibers would increase the stiffness of that polymer structure while maintaining the low density and the machinability of that polymer structure. And so that leads us into my summer research and what this process consisted of. It consisted of 3 main steps, and the first of those was to fabricate the SIOC PDC fiber mat through electrospinning. And that started out with a pre-ceramic polymer solution consisting of our pre-ceramic polymer, our spinning agent, and our catalyst. That was then placed in a syringe, which then extruded that solution out, and it exited through a metallic needle, which was necessary in order to apply a voltage source to that needle. And there was a potential difference between that needle and that membrane collector, which then allowed for the spinning of that fiber, which then collected on that in a matte form. And after we had collected that fiber mat, we then cross-linked that at 160 degrees Celsius and then pyrolyzed that at 800 degrees Celsius. And as you can see on the bottom, we have that scanning electron microscopy image of the cross-linked SiOC fiber mat to display what those fibers looked like. So after we had pyrolyzed it and it had become that polymer-derived ceramic fiber mat, we then created our composite of our commercial clear resin and our SiOC fiber mat. So in order to do this, we first created a dispersion of our SiOC fiber in our isopropanol, which then allowed us to mix that into our commercial clear resin. And we did this in varying concentrations of our SiOC fiber mat. And then after creating various concentrations, we would 3D print that composite via our stereolithography machine. And we created 2 samples of each concentration in order to determine consistency between the 2 samples. So that brings us to our third test, our third step, which was tensile testing. So after we had printed our samples, we performed tensile tests on them in order to determine how the concentration of SiOC fiber mat affected the yield strength, the stiffness, the strain to failure, and the fracture strength, which we can see in our tensile results, our tensile test results. So here we have each concentration in both of those samples on the same graph so that we can see the consistency between those 2 results. But in order to better analyze this data and to draw conclusions from it, we can look at it on this stress strain curve that compares all of the concentrations to the clear resin or the neat sample. And so specifically looking at the elastic modulus, we can make a conclusion that there is a limit to the amount of SiOC fiber mat that will increase the elastic modulus of this material. And so we can see that because between the 0.0087 weight percent and the clear resin, we see a 17% improvement in the elastic modulus. And then between the 0.013 weight percent and the clear resin, the neat sample, we can see a 27% improvement in that elastic modulus. But then, if we compare the final concentration, the highest concentration of 0.026 weight percent to the neat sample, we see a 23% decrease in the elastic modulus. So we can see that limit from our results is in this 0.013 weight percent range. Now, if we look at our strain to fracture data, we can see that across the board, that an increase in our SiOC fiber is an increase in our strain to fracture percentage, which also indicates an increase in toughness as that SiOC increases in our in weight percent. And so finally, we did some scanning electron microscopy of the cross-sectional areas of our fractured samples that came from our tensile tests. And so by doing this, we could determine the cross-sectional area and then use that calculation in our stress to determine our stress. And also in D2, we can see the evidence of the layering from our stereolithography that fabricated these samples. So in summary, I went through a brief background of stereolithography and what that is, looked at the motivation for my research, looked at my research itself and what the process was and the results from that. And then finally, going forward into this fall, we plan to actually obtain that photo-curable pre-ceramic polymer resin from France and then be able to 3D print that and perform tensile tests on that at room temperature and at high temperatures. So thank you so much, and a special thanks to National Science Foundation and Women in Engineering for allowing me to be part of this project this summer. And also a special thanks to my advisors, Dr. Singh and Dr. Salama, for all of their advice and encouragement this summer. Thank you so much. Any questions?